Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to this webinar being presented by New Hampshire Housing. This is the second presentation about design trends in multifamily housing pre and post pandemic. Last week's webinar is available online, and we will send you an email tomorrow with links to a recording of last week's webinar with Nick Cooper of HKS and Bernard Harkless of Links Ventures, and to today's webinar as well. I'm Rob Dappas. I'm the Managing Director of Management and Development with New Hampshire Housing. We provide financing to build affordable housing, multifamily housing around the state, and we provide oversight for many of these developments. New Hampshire Housing is a self-sustaining public corporation that promotes, finances, and supports affordable housing and related services for the state of New Hampshire. Today, we're going to be getting a regional perspective on trends in multifamily housing development from an architect, an engineer, and a developer. We are fortunate to be joined by KENDRA Halliwell, AIA of Icon Architecture, where she is an associate principal and practice and design team leader. Her title is my favorite of these three because it's the only one that's longer than mine. James Petersen, PE, is the founder and principal of Petersen Engineering in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And Rebecca Hatfield, who is the senior vice president of real estate for Avesta Housing based in Portland, Maine. Just a quick word about how this webinar will work. Every one of our panelists will take center stage for something like 10 minutes, where they will talk about the trends they've been observing and responding to pre and post pandemic. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A after each presentation, so you can, if you have a question, drop it into the chat at any time. Some questions we may hold until the end, depending on time, and if there are some questions that seem applicable to sort of multiple panelists' areas of expertise. Before we get started and hand it over to our panelists, I want to thank our sponsors, and our lead sponsor is Craig Deachman and Associates. It's a Manchester law firm that has been providing general counsel services to New Hampshire Housing since for a very long time. And our two series sponsors are RBC Capital Markets, syndicator of low-income housing tax credit investments and more, and TD Bank. Their support allows us to provide this kind of programming for free, so we appreciate their support and their partnership. I also want to say a quick word of thanks for our board of directors. The New Hampshire Housing's board of directors is all volunteers appointed by the governor. They work very hard to provide governance and guidance for us as staff, and also are very supportive of efforts like this to advance conversations and best practices in the industry. So we thank them for their support. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to KENDRA, and I will hide myself and reappear at the conclusion of her remarks.
Great. Thanks, Rob, and hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is such a great program. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and the discussion with the folks the other day was also enlightening, and I hope you all were able to see that as well. So I'd like to talk through three sort of levels of architectural design coming out of this COVID pandemic, starting at the most intimate, smallest private space in our homes, and then talk a little bit about what we're seeing in sort of shared common spaces, and then talk a little bit about what we're seeing in trends for outdoor space use. When I was prepping for this discussion, started thinking about how we are, this pandemic has made us think differently about where we live and where we work. And a few years ago, I worked on a number of artist live work projects. So I went back to the thinking in some of those projects. So I'd like to share two of those with you. There we are, perfect, great. So I'll look at a new construction project and then a mill reuse project. So this is a development that we did in a historic district in Boston's South End. And our goal here was to design open, flexible living and working spaces for artists in a multifamily building. So what you're seeing here are these open plans, and we were very careful and very thoughtful about laying out usable spaces in each of these apartments that could then, if the resident chose to, could be subdivided up with walls to really create privacy. I think throughout this pandemic, we've seen and heard issues with needing privacy for calls. I know when I'm on a call, I need to shut the door because I tend to be louder than my husband. With kids around, being able to close doors and have privacy for these sorts of quiet workspaces is really important. So designating clear space and allowing for flexibility in the apartment layout is really important. Let's go to the next slide here, talking some more about flexibility. So this is a project that we did in Lowell, Massachusetts. This is a wonderful old mill building. We created, I think, 130 artist live work spaces, and using this exciting old building, we took advantage of the different conditions around the building to design specific layouts and apartments within this framework. So I can't point to the screen, but the plan there at the bottom left has different colored apartment layouts on the plan there. The pink ones at the bottom left are two-story apartments that open out into the courtyard, and they also have a lower level for sleeping and living. So these we called live work cell units, and the image there that looks like a garage door with a small canopy next to it. These apartments were actually able to open up a garage door to really open to the outdoors, which again is another thing that we've been seeing a greater desire for opening to the outdoors as a place to get fresh air or to open to outside. So this would be something we would recommend if there's an opportunity to do something like this in projects that you're looking at. We also were looking at both a tight structural grid, as these mill buildings tend to have. I think in this case we had a 9-foot column grid. The little 3D plan there shows the fairly large open space around the apartment, the live workspace, and the white block in the middle is the core, the plumbing core that housed the kitchen and the bathroom. So if we go to the next slide here, we've got some layouts. We looked at multiple iterations of how these would lay out. Great. So I color-coded these with the orange dot is the designated workspace in each of these plans. The 4 plans on the far left show this core module that can be located in a number of orientations in the space, allowing maximum flexibility and movement and creating spaces around this core of the plumbing, which of course works for keeping the mechanicals and plumbing systems nice and efficient as well. But really paying attention to making sure that you have that space is really helpful. The 3 sets of plans on the far right are 2-story plans that show different locations, again, for how to circulate and how to use the workspace in each of these layouts. The one in the middle with the uppermost orange dot is that live work cell layout that included the opening onto the courtyard for maximum visibility should there be an event in this greater courtyard. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's great to look at these mill buildings that have all the space in the world, but then when we're looking at some new construction of a sort of mid-rise or elevator building type, space is much more tight in demand. So what we're showing now, this is a 1-bedroom apartment that we just built, and we're looking to do much more of this. We looked at a couple of iterations of this, but the plan that's shown here is favored, and it's favored because the workspace, the desk space in this case, is off to the side and can be separated off. I mentioned this earlier. It's one thing to be able to have your desk, you know, in your bedroom or next to the couch in the living room, or to work at the kitchen island or kitchen table like I do often. But being able to have the workspace tucked off to the side where it could be privatized is of value should there be kids or other people working in the same home trying to carve out those spaces. And it makes for a really nice little workspace. We've got a photo there. This is a project we built in Jamaica Plain. I think we have a couple more, I have a couple more slides here. Talking about some larger scale community spaces as we come out of the private living space. So I've got a few images here of a project that we recently completed. It was just before COVID, but there are some great aspects of this project that I wanted to share with you that you know, we see differently now. Our Finch project that we worked on with Petersen Engineering, you'll hear from James here in a minute, is a passive house building. It's got all the bells and whistles, including some really interesting aspects. One being a open stair that's shown here at the bottom left. The client wanted to include the open stair in order to invite activity, in order to encourage people to take the stairs instead of taking the elevator. The elevator is tucked around through those doors, but the stair is right there and is very inviting. This is an egress stair. It was a complicated detailing challenge, but it really made it inviting for everybody. The lower level down to the left goes to the parking garage, and going up goes up to the residential floors. So we're seeing more of that as we've seen people choose to take stairs rather than hop in an elevator in a tight space with other people. This project also included a wonderful top floor common space and laundry and roof deck. All of these are relatively common in multifamily buildings, but the location of these, putting them on the roof, really makes it a place you would want to go and enjoy, both with the view and for the usefulness of it. We also included small spaces, small private spaces. There's an image there with the blue accent walls that are multi-purpose rooms that could be used as needed for sort of small residential uses. I also wanted to note sociologically, we've also seen more of a desire for movable furniture in these common spaces so that people can pull the furniture around to choose to either be with other people or to take them elsewhere. So I thought I'd throw that in as well. I think we have one more slide to talk about outdoor space. I pulled some images together of some of my favorite outdoor spaces and to talk through some of these. I think what's really important here is look for these spaces in your project, whether they're large or small. Some of these might be, I think the importance here is programming. If there's a common room, see if you could get an outdoor space adjacent to that. If you have townhouse or row house or units that hit the ground, try to figure out how they can hit the ground, provide private residential entries like the townhouses we're showing here. If you can make a roof deck work, you know, the size, even a small intimate space can be valuable. Program these areas. We're seeing much more demand and importance on programmed outdoor space. Get grills, get a number of small gathering areas so that smaller groups can enjoy that space. We've been including walking trails on sites in order to really encourage and make the most of this outdoor space. wanted to mention the image here on the far left is a live work project that we did a few years ago, and this space was initially covered over. It's only 10 feet wide, but it's where all the back doors come together, and we worked on this project with the existing artists who lived here, and they were really concerned that this space would be dark, it would be unused, it would be full of trash barrels, and it turned out to be a really wonderful gathering space. So even a 10-foot wide space between buildings can turn into a nice outdoor space for everyone to use. I think one of the greatest things, one good thing hopefully coming out of this pandemic time is seeing our downtowns become much more vibrant. Taking over parking spaces to allow people to sit outside at restaurants. I hope that this is something that we can continue to see and encourage you all to patronize these places and try to get these outdoor spaces to stay. It really, there's a great value in this outdoor space. So I think those are my slides, and I think I'd love to open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Kendra.
Thanks, Rob.
Nobody has dropped a question into the chat just yet, and and I think everybody's muted right now. So I anticipate there will be a lot of overlap and sort of between your topics and James's sort of more engineering related topics.
Thanks, Kendra. Thanks, Rob. So I thought what I would do, and welcome everyone, is really kind of maybe try to level the playing field a little bit by showing everybody this diagram. It's a very simple one of a ERV ventilation system in a single family occupancy. What we're talking about is multifamily, but the basics that I want to review is going to apply to multifamily. So just a quick overview, ERV energy recovery basics. We're recovering, if you think about the winter season, we're recovering the heat from the exhaust airstream, and we're putting the heat into the supply airstream without cross-contamination of the exhaust stream and the fresh air airstream. And we're taking exhaust from the kitchen area. If you look at the magenta ductwork, we're taking exhaust from the kitchen area and from the bathroom. And the blue duct represents fresh air, and we're supplying fresh air into the living, dining, kitchen area and the bedroom. So energy recovery units have been around for a long time, and they're pretty ubiquitous at this point. They're on just about all of our projects. And one of their characteristics is that they provide balanced airflow. So we're exhausting the same amount of air as we're supplying to the space. And we'll see why that is important when we talk about the impact of COVID and airborne contaminants in a minute. The other thing to note about the ventilation approach here is that it's decoupled. It's separate from the heating and cooling system. And the fundamental reason for that and benefit of that is that the need for ventilation is continuous. So we typically run ventilation systems in our projects 24/7, 365. There's no interface with the occupant. The expectation is that the space benefits from ventilation continuously, and there's no time when it doesn't benefit from ventilation. Contrast that with heating and cooling, especially as enclosures get better, the requirements for heating and cooling is more intermittent. So we only run heating and cooling systems when there's calls for heat and cooling, and the ventilation runs all the time. One thing that's become more apparent to us, and we're really trying to help with transformation in the industry, is an appreciation for the importance of duct sealing. In order for a ventilation system to be effective, the ducts need to be airtight. So just like they're has been an increase of appreciation for air tightness in building enclosures, we're really working hard to help the industry appreciate the benefits of air tightness in ductwork systems. And there's a lot of things we're doing to reinforce that and help with some transition in the industry there. Basically, the air needs to get from where you intend it to come from, and it needs to get to where you want it to go. And that all seems obvious, but the fact of the matter is that ductwork that is insufficiently airtight is pretty common. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is getting into post-pandemic realizations, is that this utilization of ERV, which was initially instigated mostly because of an interest in energy efficiency, if you think about it through the pandemic lens, which everybody's wearing those glasses still, is it's 100% outside air system. So like I said earlier, the exhaust air stream is completely separated from the makeup air or the fresh air stream, and the cross-contamination from the two air streams is essentially negligible. And that's why we call it a 100% outside air system. And so that's turned out to be a really nice set of circumstances with regard to transmission of airborne contaminants. Many HVAC systems combine the heating and cooling system with the ventilation system, and those systems recirculate air and bring a percentage of fresh air in. But we're in a nice set of circumstances in that our designs, and probably most of yours, decoupled ventilation from heating and cooling, and hopefully don't include recirculation, because it's hard to retrofit or recirculating air system with modifications to address airborne contaminants. But there are some things you can do, and we'll get into that in a minute. The filtration has been a real focus over the last year. What can we do to filter air and help our cause in terms of transmission? And with the ERV, there's really no filter that's incorporated into the ERV. Better place for an improved filter is in the heating and cooling unit, which is oftentimes a fan coil unit, oftentimes a vertical fan coil unit. So filters with increased efficiency can be retrofitted oftentimes, and in new construction incorporated. And we'll talk about filter efficiency in a minute. So over the course of the pandemic, we got really familiar with emphasis on being outdoors if you can, and if you're indoors, being in a well ventilated space. So this balanced ventilation approach is a really nice benefit. Indoors during the pandemic, if there was a source of the contaminant, a contagious person, it's hard to be in the same apartment with a contagious person and have there not be significant risk. But there are some things that can mitigate that, and having the apartment be well ventilated with a ventilation system that actually works is something that mitigates that risk. So I'll get into a little bit more. I think that's about it for this slide. So why don't we go to the next slide? And I'm going to speak to one technology that you've probably heard of. I've certainly heard a lot about it over the last year, which is ionization. It's another name for it is it's various types of electronic air filters, and I've called it the I think of it as like the bad news, and then we'll get some good news in here. Over the course of the pandemic, there was a lot of new marketing around ionization. It was relatively affordable, relatively easy to retrofit, and promised a lot. And there was a case for me where a nonprofit came to me and said, "What can we do?" And I said, well, I'm really familiar with your systems and you might try this, but it is considered by ASHRAE an emerging technology. And when I dug further, the reason why it's considered that is although it's been around for several decades now, there's a lack of independent research to indicate that it's effective, that it works. And as the pandemic played out, there was more data that was coming in that not only indicated that this technology was not effective, but that there may be some concern that it causes harm. So independent researchers were motivated to write an open letter. On April 12th, it was published, and that was to combat the notion that some investments of significance, because the federal government was providing money for schools, would go towards this technology, and the independent researchers were recommending against that there were better things you could do with the money. So let's go to the next slide and talk about that. So here's what does work, and it's pretty simple, and it's kind of mundane. And sometimes people don't like simple, mundane solutions, but here they are. So increasing your filter efficiency to MERV 13 is very effective, and it's proven, and it helps a lot in terms of filtering very small particles out. And those very small particles include bacteria, viruses, very small particle dust, and smoke. And the nice thing about MERV 13 is that it's an efficiency that allows you to filter those things out without creating a large capital expense associated with accommodating the filter. As you go up in efficiency above MERV 13, you have a very significant filter, and it has increased pressure drop associated with it. It's physically larger and can't be accommodated. So MERV 13, and I'll show you another slide, not yet though, that shows where that stacks up relative to other filtration levels. But on the right here is a pretty low-tech thing. I bought one myself for my own home for less than $200. It's a portable plug-in HEPA filter. It runs in our kitchen, dining, living area 24 hours a day. It's a HEPA filter, which is an increased level of filtration, even smaller particles, and it's effective. The other couple things I want to mention about what works is thank God for operable windows. Operable windows work, and buildings need to not only have operable windows, but operable windows that are easily usable and work well, are convenient for the occupants, because under certain outdoor conditions, you can dramatically increase the ventilation rate that is experienced in the apartment, and therefore you're diluting the contaminant. In this case, we're talking about a virus to a level where it's not contagious in a lot of circumstances. The other thing I want to mention that works, and this is virtually impossible to do with an existing building, but a new building, is taking advantage of compartmentalization, which is making sure that each apartment is air sealed from the adjacent apartments. And that's a way to contain contaminants at the source and not have them leak to the neighbor. So let's go to the fourth and final slide. And just a little bit more information. We just pulled this from the web. It's pre-pandemic. It's emphasizing recommended filtration for allergy and asthma sufferers, but it makes a point that I want to drill down on just a little bit more before I turn it back to Rob. So the two MERV filtration levels on the left are typical MERV efficiencies, 6 and 8, that just protect the HVAC equipment from big particles, mold spores, pet dander, dust lint, that sort of thing, pollen, and fine dust to a certain small size. MERV 13 adds some really critical smaller particles, of which virus is very interesting to us now. And so not only viruses, but bacteria, smoke, and really fine dust, as well as odors. So this just gives you an idea of what MERV 13 gets you, opposed to what's typically in HVAC equipment, which is MERV 6 and 8. And it gets you a lot at a reasonable cost. This graph interestingly targets hospitals for the application of MERV 13. But now we're seeing the application of MERV 13 to be widespread in all human occupied buildings, including schools, as well as affordable housing and other housing. So I'll stop there and look forward to any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, James. That was really interesting, and nice to hear a shout out for old-fashioned technology in the form of operable windows. I remember a rehab that we financed where one of the occupants, an older lady, said that for the first time after the windows were replaced, she could open her windows, and that it had changed her life. And so there's something to be said for giving people a sense of control as well.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a question from North Sturdivant. He asked one of KENDRA, which we'll get to later, but one for you specifically, and you did get into this a little bit more in your presentation, but maybe you can speak to it some more. He's just asking, in that diagram of the energy recovery HRV, you showed the kitchen exhaust going into the HRV, and he asked how you were handling filtering for particulates in a system like that. And so when you talk about those MERV filters, do those generally exist in the energy recovery system as well, or is that mostly in the ductwork for the climate control system, or both?
Yeah, it's going to be in the heating and cooling unit, which is typically a fan coil unit of some sort. And the reason, it takes a little head scratching, but in the energy recovery or heat recovery ventilator, the outside airstream is outside air. So luckily and fortunately in New Hampshire, outside air is generally clean. So there's no need to filter that except for those large particles like pollen and things of that nature. So there's no application for a MERV 13 filter there. And the exhaust air, we're just trying to get it out of the building. So there's no interest in filtering that airstream. So that's why filtration doesn't take place at the energy recovery ventilator. It takes place in the heating and cooling unit where you're recirculating. And when you have a call for heating and cooling, that's when you're taking advantage of that opportunity to filter out small particles. So that's where you want the increased efficiency filter.
I see. So what you're recovering from the air that's coming from the kitchen is heat and energy, but not the air itself, I guess.
That's right. There's no, it's like magic, but there's a transfer of heat at the heat exchanger in the energy recovery ventilator, and also moisture when it's an energy recovery instead of heat recovery ventilator. But there's no transfer of particles or air recirculation. A very small, negligible amount. It's 1%. And some might say, well, isn't any cross-contamination a bad thing? And what we learned over the course of the pandemic is what was important for getting for the virus to be contagious were a few things. And a few of those things included the duration of which you're exposed to the virus and the concentration. And so 1% doesn't move the needle. So we consider that 100% outside air system. Okay.
I do have another question that came up in just sort of talking about this topic with somebody else before the presentation. We've seen at New Hampshire Housing different approaches in both the energy recovery systems and the heating and cooling systems in terms of equipment, and whether they're centralized and there's sort of centralized ductwork, or more alternatively more sort of residential systems that are small and serve units individually. And one might think that if you're worried about breathing somebody else's air, that the individual units would be preferable. However, I think it's fair to say, in general, the trend had been to move away from those because it's nice to have fewer penetrations in your building envelope and have fewer places that you're going to maintain equipment. So I'm curious if you think that the pandemic has, sort of where you think the best practices are for multifamily housing on that question, and whether the pandemic has changed it in either direction.
I think it's impacted in that there's more of a pull towards individual systems. I think it's mostly from a perception standpoint. So where we see individual systems most commonly is in condos or market rate apartments, where there's a real emphasis on individual utility metering. But if you think about the heating and cooling system, usually what's connecting the heating and cooling system is piping, refrigerant piping, or hydronic hot water or chilled water piping. So there's no risk of cross-contamination associated with the heating and cooling system. With ventilation systems, if you think of my diagram, and now you think of a dedicated outside air unit on the roof, a large piece of HVAC equipment on the roof, and you network the ductwork to include exhaust from multiple apartments and fresh air back to multiple apartments, there's no point in that tree, if you will, where there's a cross-contamination between apartments. That's why I was emphasizing compartmentalization as a prudent measure. And the other difficulty with individual systems, especially when it comes to ventilation systems, if you have a very small apartment, now you might be trying to find a place for a water heater, a ventilation unit, a heating and cooling unit, maybe a washer and dryer. So you're basically putting too much burden on the space for real estate, for HVAC and plumbing that you'd rather use for people.
Right. Okay, so a few more questions have popped up, and I would like to get to these, but I also want to make sure that Rebecca has enough time to talk. So James, if you have time to answer those in the question box in the next few minutes, then that's great. And if not, we can get to them sort of in our moderated Q&A towards the end of the hour. But for right now, I'd like to transition over to Rebecca Hatfield. So thank you, James. And Rebecca, are you there? You are. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Rob, and welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know Avesta, Avesta is a nonprofit affordable housing developer, owner, and manager, and we own and operate over 100 communities throughout Maine and New Hampshire. So today I'm going to talk about what this all means for residents and what we're thinking about from the developer perspective. When Rob contacted me and asked me about participating in this and told me the topic was post-pandemic multifamily housing design, I immediately thought of one thing. And I think it's the same question I've been contemplating and our team has been contemplating the entire year, and many of you have probably been asking yourselves. And that question is, how much do we change based on 1 year? I think for us, it comes down to this assessment is, what are the long-term and permanent changes in how our residents are living in and utilizing their homes and community? And when we started to consider the long-term changes and how we adapt our approach, some of the considerations were a fairly significant departure from the pre-COVID considerations, but most of it was just reprioritizing what we already started to do and moving things from a nice to have to an essential feature. But there was definitely one clear theme. That theme was a home has become more than just a home. I think this has always been true in theory, but the pandemic forced people to embrace it. It's not just a roof over our residents' head. It's a multi-use, multifunctional space that we all know is critical to stability. And what we found was the major long-lasting theme that has come out of last year is that our residents have a greater need for self-sufficiency within their home. So next I want to talk about some trends and then ideas and features that we've been thinking about putting in our developments. So starting with the trends that we saw across our 4,600 residents, and these are what's driving the changes as we move forward. The first one is online usage. This is an obvious one. We've been talking about the digital divide for years. but the divide was accelerated over the last year because of the way the businesses and organizations adapted. They built out infrastructure to go online so that they could reach people. And now that they've spent the money, that's not going away. The world has embraced being remote. So we've seen a significant increase in our households using the internet for basic activities, especially in our properties that house older people who before may not have even known how to get online or access the internet. We've seen some of the service needs of our residents now can be met online. So before, Avesta had done a lot of work around telehealth, but now it's not just telehealth, it's social work, it's counseling, it's case management, and the list goes on. Education is another theme under online usage, digital access. And although kids are going back to school, kids are being issued iPads and laptops and computers instead of books. Online college education is more common and more widely accepted, especially for those who are working and going to school part-time. Also under online usage was the increase of paying of bills online and paying rent online. We saw an exponential increase in our residents making rent payments online. And then the last piece in terms of online usage was obviously connection to family, friends, and neighbors, and connections to the outside world, like news distribution. This is what mitigated isolation in the past, and I don't think people are going to let go of that. So increased online services was trend number one. Number two that we were seeing is that coming out of the pandemic, lower wage jobs are more abundant. They were almost non-existent before, but now many of our residents have found jobs that are remote. And so we're asking ourselves, are our apartments more conducive to remote work, access and sitting in your home for hours at a time, space allocation, the layout of the floor plan so it can accommodate 1, 2, or 3 members of a household all being at home, or having other spaces within the building that people can have a place to work or do homework or have private time. The third trend that we saw was deliveries. Deliveries. You should all take a moment and ask yourself, how many deliveries did you receive in the last year in comparison to the years prior? Well, we saw a lot more in our resident population. Basic items and needs are now available to be delivered to our residents to their front door for free. It started with groceries and household items, and now it's medication, meals, even vaccinations. Vaccinations were you come to us, and then they changed to, no, wait, we'll come to you and bring the vaccination to you. And that's the trend that's growing. So this leads to, how does our building support the delivery of goods and services and programming? The fourth trend we saw is that people actually sit outside in the wintertime. I mean, this is Maine and New Hampshire, and we didn't see anyone do that very often before. But over the last year, people socialize for extended periods of time in many of our outside common areas. And we think this will be a trend going forward. Will people do it as often as before? Maybe not, because they're not forced to, but will they continue to do it? Absolutely. And then the last thing was communications. It was tough to reach people over the last year, whether it was distributing rent relief information or just checking in on residents. We had to get creative. So all of this has driven what we're thinking about in terms of features moving into the post-pandemic. And so that's my last slide, is I'm going to talk about the ideas and features that we're thinking about. So we're obviously thinking about all the things that Kendra and James mentioned in terms of building design and indoor air quality. That's always been top priority for us. But some of the other things we're also thinking about are broadband access is now critical. And there's 2 challenges with it. One, in rural areas, it's not always available. And 2, it's very costly to install and support for residents long-term. But the need to provide broadband throughout the building is no longer nice to have. It's a must-have for our resident population. So we're looking into that for our buildings going forward, and our existing buildings as well. The second thing is there's a need for more multifunctional flex space of different sizes for programming and use. So for example, we're considering a flex community space in a building that has dividers, so the room could be split. It also has movable tables or movable furnitures, which Kendra referenced, which would allow the room to be reconfigured in different ways. we would build this space in addition to the community room. So now we have not only one community space, but we have 2 or 3 or 4 community spaces that can be used either by an individual or by a group of residents or a service provider. Another feature that we've thought a lot more about is all-season multifunctional outdoor areas, including prioritizing outdoor space that's fully accessible. Given the amount of use that we saw the last year, we think that outdoor areas and building out more community spaces outdoors is going to be very important. And then we've also considered building access and communications. Building access that's conducive to the coming and going of service providers. And then on the communication side, what we're looking at is we want communications that allow for mass communication to be delivered digitally and updated frequently, whether that's emergencies or building service notices, or simply just to push out information about services or programming. We recently installed media panels in some of our community rooms as a way to enhance communication and make it so it's more frequent and more effective, because some of our residents, they don't pick up their phone, or they don't know how to get a text, or they don't check their email very often. So this is a great way to put communication in common areas so they see it when they're walking outside of the building. And then the last feature that we've talked about is obviously around the idea of deliveries. The first one is a mail room and a package room. I've never had so many conversations on developments about mail rooms and package rooms in the past 6 months. The need to be able to receive essential items has become really important. And I'd have to say a form of a package room is really something you only saw in a luxury building before, but it's not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity. And so our residents have to have a secure place for the increasing number of packages that they're receiving on a daily basis. And the other part of that is, I'm not one for more parking, but we have talked about dedicating a parking space for loading and unloading. And that's for UPS trucks, FedEx trucks, service providers, or people just loading and unloading groceries, or community members that are delivering meals. But having a parking space or 2 right in front of the building would help accommodate the number of deliveries that our residents are getting. So to conclude, again, I'm not sure all of these ideas are new ideas, but they've definitely become ideas that are top of mind to help our residents live in a world that's evolved. And so now I'd like to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It was a great presentation and a nice way to sort of tie these topics together and talk about the people who live in these in the housing that we all work to create and manage and operate. So we don't have any sort of questions that are specific to you. I think there's a question that Ben Frost, our colleague here at New Hampshire Housing, asked in the chat, which I think was sort of following on a comment in James's presentation, but I think is just as much a question of sort of development and architecture choices. So I'd like to float that one. And Kendra and James, if you would like to get ready to reveal yourselves here in a minute, then we can discuss this together. So Rebecca, the question that Ben asked just a few minutes ago was, James talked about compartmentalizing units and air sealing between units as a method of sort of indoor air quality control. Ben asked about common spaces in multifamily structures such as hallways, whether the panel would recommend reducing hall length, increasing width, creating unit groups or pods within a structure, which he acknowledges may add to the project cost. And I thought this was interesting because for those of you with long memories, there was a New Hampshire Housing Conference 3 or 4 years ago where we got a presentation on a project in Franklin that Catch did, which was structured around a floor plan that didn't have any double loaded corridors. It had kind of clusters of 3 or 4 units per floor around a little lobby, which was intended to foster more of a sense of community, but might have some of these kinds of ancillary benefits as well. So James answered in the chat. I don't know, Rebecca or Kendra, if that's something that you've given any thought to or think is worth considering.
I'd love to respond to that. Specifically, I'm working on a couple of projects with James right now. They're both affordable housing. One is about to go into construction, and it consists of a mix of housing types, both townhouses and a mid-rise, and existing renovations, modernizations. And that client a few months ago reached out to the architectural and engineering team and said, okay, guys, what should we do? Is there anything we need to change before we start construction? Now's the time, it's all on paper. And looking at the different housing types and looking at what we have designed, the engineering team confidently responded to the client saying, we've got what's important, which is ERVs providing fresh air to the apartments, and actually to each of the bedrooms. I mean, that's really the critical factor there. And just to note on that, I think there is an additional cost that comes with providing this mechanical ventilation, but we think that the benefits outweigh those costs, as I think we've been seeing. There are different ways of doing it. In the townhouses, we incorporated individual ERVs of a certain type. In the mid-rise building, there are different ways to do that. There's either individual in unit that James mentioned earlier, perhaps for a home ownership type. There's the by floor. We're starting to see different levels, different ways to do it, either big ones for the whole building, working through the corridors. I think more important than making, we always try to design these buildings to have the least non-rentable space and the highest efficiency possible. So I think we're already doing that. But I wanted to share that the ERV is probably the highest and best use of some financing going into designing buildings after this pandemic.
Great, thanks, Kendra. Rebecca, is there anything you'd care to add either on the mechanical ventilation question or the question of sort of separate entries or smaller clusters of units as opposed to long corridors, or those conversations that you've been having at Avesta?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is it's definitely conversations that we're having, and for the reasons that both Kendra and James mentioned, but also because as it pertains to an older adult population, 55 plus or 62 plus, we find that that's a preference because it feels more like a home. They're not as excited to move. If you're moving from a home, they don't necessarily want to move into a double loaded corridor that feels like, a large apartment building that's high density. They would much prefer to have their own entry or have a small cluster, only 2 or 3 other residents right next to them. But Rob, you hit the nail on the head when you said we have to consider the costs. And so that's where we battle as a developer, where yes, we're considering it, but it's not necessarily the most efficient approach to development for affordable housing. But the benefits are significant.
Yeah. I think it's, I told our guests this afternoon that they didn't have to be polite to their host. And I think as a financing agency, we always struggle with how to quantify things like, amenities that contribute to a sense of community. And so to all 3 of you, but to our attendees today as well, if there are things that you think that we at New Hampshire Housing should be doing or other sort of stakeholders should be doing to encourage things that really add value to housing that's not currently measured in the qualified allocation plan or other allocation tools, we welcome those conversations. We've got a few minutes left. Among the panelists, did any of you have questions for each other that you'd like to discuss?
I would like to just make a comment. During the pandemic has lessened, thankfully, in large part due to vaccination. But the emphasis on outdoors, I think, is a great takeaway. One thing that I was challenged to do when we were in the thick of it was help people understand the relative safety of outdoors versus indoors. And there's only so much you can do indoors to increase safety. That's just a fact of the matter. So outdoors is just so much safer by hundreds of times, as it turns out, in terms of amount of air movement and the effectiveness of dilution. But I think we're on the right track by emphasizing common spaces, common gathering areas outdoors that are very very welcoming and as comfortable as can be. So I like that. I like that everybody's paying attention to that.
Great.
Great.
Part of the part of the research or preparation that I did in before this webinar was looking back over old articles in industry journals. Not that old, but last May feels like a long time ago at this point, and reading about the kinds of things that they said might be coming out of the pandemic in terms of people's desire to maintain social distance, or people's concern about contamination in the kitchen, or any other sort of other kind of health-related components of housing, whether it was real-time particulate monitoring or things like that in apartments. I'm curious if any of the three of you have thoughts about things that 6 months ago you thought was going to be a big and enduring issue, and it turns out not to be, or things that a lot of people are saying will be with us forever, but in fact, it's something that is on everybody's mind right now, but we will have forgotten in a year or two.
Well, I'll jump in again and say that the way people use their homes, as Rebecca pointed out, I think that's going to stay. We're using our homes for much more than we did previously, and I don't see that going back to quote unquote normal.
Okay.
And I would echo that. I mean, I think 6 months ago, we all questioned, when everyone went remote, is that going to stick? Is that going to stay? And people are going to stay remote, or are companies going to ask everyone to come back? Or even lower wage, jobs, are they going to be remote? And I think what we're seeing is, again, as I mentioned, remote is something that's very common. That's not going to go away. And we all thought it would just shift back to pre-2020, but it's not shifting back to pre-2020. And to James' point, a home is going to be permanently a multifunctional space.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. This is a sea change in the way we live.
Yeah.
Across the.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think maybe on that note of consensus, maybe we should wrap it up. We're right at 5 o'clock now, so just a quick thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate the conversation and your contributions. It's given us a lot to think about, and I think we'll all be interested to see how these topics evolve and what our housing looks like, if it's different at all over the next year or two and beyond. For all of the attendees, as I said at the outset, we'll send you an email with a link to the recording for this presentation. And the last one, I think that will also include a log so you can see the Q&A with the written questions and answers. I do also want to say a quick thanks to the staff at New Hampshire Housing, Kristen Brewster, Grace Lessner, and George Reagan, who add all the organizational capacity to make this stuff possible and to make it run well. And on a final note, to everybody in the audience, this is the first time we in the multifamily division have been doing this as sort of a substitute for our multifamily conference. At some point, we do plan to get back to conferences, but we may keep doing these kinds of webinars. If you have ideas about topics that we should be thinking about, or voices that we should be elevating through this kind of forum, we would love to hear your thoughts, and we'll definitely take them into consideration. I think that's it. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, James. And thanks to all our attendees. And have a good rest of your evening.